Hello, hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where or when in the world that you're listening to this webinar. I'm really happy to have an exciting webinar with my good friend Cassie now later here in a bit. So we're going to give a few minutes just to allow for attendees to join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started here in about 2 minutes or so. Cassie, in the interim, I hear that you have two wonderful dogs. What are their names, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure, it's actually three. I have a large, medium, and small. I have a English cream golden retriever named Han Solo because we
Okay.
used to have Luke Skywalker, but he's no longer with us. And then I have a, Bichon Frise named Riley, and then I have a little Yorkie, and her name is Alice.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. And do you walk all three at the same time?
No, it is like impossible. They don't go on walks. They have the backyard.
Oh, no, that's glorious. They can just go play and have a good
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, now that I'm fully hydrated, we are getting kind of close to our 2 minute mark here. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Let's get started. And then as people join in, um, we can kind of address things accordingly. So, hello, everyone. First and foremost, really excited that you've joined us for today's webinar. This webinar is going to be on SBOMs and VEX program foundations. It's going to be featuring the absolutely incredible Cassie Crossley, the VP of Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric, and author of an incredibly new O'Reilly book on software supply chain security that I can't wait to hear more about. My name is Cortez Frazier Jr. I am a senior product manager at FOSSA. Kind of before I go over the agenda and, kind of introduce Cassie immediately, I do want to just cover some additional housekeeping. So first, we're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A. So please post any questions that you have in the question section. And if they're incredibly timely, we may even address a few of them as we're going through the content to kind of give you some additional context. Next, this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out to you after the event. And finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you after the webinar with a few additional resources to see if there's anything that we can do to help your organization, especially within the SBOM management process. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at today's agenda. So for the first part of our webinar, we're going to cover SBOM 101, really deep foundational information on things like, why are SBOMs becoming so important now? We'll take a look at, some of the SBOM data fields, structures, and display a few examples for those who have not had any experience with SBOMs up to this point. And then we'll start to shift to a discussion on VEX, which stands for the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, along with what data fields that you should include in a VEX document and how to use those at scale. The third part of our webinar will discuss VEX and SBOMs, how they're used in tandem and how those begin to partner together. And then finally, we'll close with some high-level recommendation for generating SBOMs, distributing SBOMs, and then getting started with VEX before transitioning over to the Q&A portion. And then, of course, the most important part of the webinar, hearing all about Cassie's new book. So before I hand things over to Cassie and we kind of begin our wonderful conversation, a few quick words for those who are not familiar with FOSSA who have joined the webinar. So FOSSA is we have a SBOM management solution that enables users to generate SBOMs in various formats, Cyclone DX, SPDX, kind of across the broader spectrum there. You can import SBOMs from suppliers that are being provided for you or from other aspects of your organization that you can then consolidate and combine into releases so you can continuously monitor for both license compliance, vulnerabilities, and then quality issues as well. And then we also have some distribution capability for you to then be able to share your SBOMs out with your users. Our platform also helps companies identify, prioritize, and remediate open source risk and vulnerabilities across the board as software composition analysis capabilities. And we will identify and comply with licenses and open source code as well. With that, now I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Cassie Crossley. Like I mentioned, Cassie is the VP of Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric, where she leads several really innovative SBOM management initiatives. I'm really excited to share more about that with the audience. Cassie's also the author of a new O'Reilly book, Software Supply Chain Security, Securing the End-to-End Supply Chain for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. So we're thrilled that she's joined us for this webinar. And with that, Cassie, I'll hand things off to you to share a little bit more about your background, and then we can kick off the presentation.
Sure. Thanks so much, Cortez, for having me and for FOSSA. I have been in technology for many decades, started out as a developer, but developer and extrovert is not really go hand in hand well together. So I moved into some other roles, eventually leading different organizations and different projects and technical projects, both from a development side, but then also on the IT side. So I've been all over the different technology areas within companies, different size companies, but also on the business side, working a lot with solutions as a consultant and just pretty much in most kinds of roles. And I've been with Schneider for 14 years, started out as a PMO director for a video line of business, and then moved into program management and directorship of some various internal projects, eventually moving about 8 years ago into the CISO organization, the cybersecurity organization, where I led governance and policy. And then approximately 5 years ago, moving over to product security, which is really, my true love is I want to help build products and really get them out the door. And now I'm charged, of course, with not only just the software side, but also the firmware and the different areas, not just from a software capabilities, but where things are being manufactured and how they're being manufactured. So really wide and diverse scope, which led me into, even though the book is called Software Supply Chain Security, I, of course, had to add a lot more because there's so much more. I mean, if you buy an iPhone and it has 50 apps installed, you still have the hardware on there too.
Right.
And there's a lot to consider. We're not just in a software-only digital world.
Wow, no, that is incredible. Your background is so extensive, and so I think you're going to be a wealth of knowledge for our audience today. And I completely agree and align with you as far as that passion for getting high quality products out the door. So I'm glad that we'll be able to relate a little bit there. Kind of just beginning the conversation, I want to talk a little bit about kind of why SBOMs are such a big deal. Way back when, right, we had Executive Order 14028, obviously in response to some recent attacks, right? Both a combination of celebrity CVEs is a term that I stole from you. I apologize. I think it's a great one.
It's not my term.
In the form of Log4j, and then kind of the solar winds, and the level of impact for that, and that really bringing this realization that we're all relying on these open source components, but we don't really have a lot of insight into how they're being maintained, or even on the closed source side, frankly, we don't have a lot of insight into how they're being maintained. And so thus, the SBOM was born, the software bill of materials. At the end of the day, what we're looking to, or what the United States government was looking to do, is accomplish a standard by which that you can require companies to provide a bill of materials of all the software components used, with the thinking and mindset that someone can then consume those in some way to then have insight into the level of risk that they're taking on by using your products. And I think if I remember correctly, you actually had a little bit of a hand in formulating some of that. Could you share more about that, Cassie?
Yeah, I joined when it was part of the NTIA, or part of the the Chamber of Commerce and the Department of Commerce. I was in the NTIA SBOM working groups and helping with the language on certain documents. And one of the things that I helped adjust is the SBOM definition, and really trying to tweak it along with everybody else. And so when the executive order came out, I was at my mom's house, and I got the news that the executive order was released because we were expecting it. And I saw that my definition was, well, not, I mean, it's everybody's definition, but I had a hand in that definition of SBOM that was in the document. So I was very proud. I'm like, I'm sure the president read my definition before this was put out. So it was sort of, anonymous contribution that I was really pleased with.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I know without a doubt in my mind that the president did read that, and there's no way that was skipped over. So no, I think that's really an incredible story. And so happy to have you. That then kind of leads me into going from SBOM basics into what kind of information really goes into these things. And the nice part about the executive order is and as usual with these things, we put out information, but not a lot of structure, not a lot of requirements around them. And so the NTIA then kind of came around and said, like, hey, these are the minimum elements that you need to make sure you include in your SBOM for it to have some level of quality for people to be able to actually use on a regular basis. So that's going to be everything you see on the slides here: supplier name, component name, version of the component, right? Those are very basics in order for us to help identify that component. But the most important one, in my eyes, is the unique identifiers. Now, of course, if you're using open source components, things like package URLs, pearls are a great option for you to be able to uniquely identify those. As we all know, that two packages can be hosted in different registries, they can be forked, they can be maintained, and all these things start to expose how they are actually fundamentally different components. And so I think you've also had some experiences when it comes to handling things like CPE in particular. Could you tell us a little bit more about that as you manage that layering problem?
Yes. So CPE, just think of it as more of an official name that is used by the NVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database, to identify a product. But we know over time products change names. For us, we had a large brand name change about 7 or 8 years ago, and making sure that products and the CPEs, as they're called, that enumeration is correct. But what happens if you want to rebrand? So we're still trying to work through that unique issue. And secondly, unless you've created or had a vulnerability listed for that product, it may not be in there. So if I have a product that releases tomorrow or March 1st, and it doesn't have a vulnerability in the database, I can't really get a CPE registered for it. And then, so I put in this SBOM what the product name is, but what happens if it changes to 2 months down the road or something of that? And there could be similar names of product, right? I mean, it's different people have, of course, so it's a combination of things. How truly unique is it? It may not be. So I think it's, the naming problem that we have in the SBOM, it's going to be something that's going to progress and that we're working through. But it is a challenge for those of us that are producing product software bill of materials.
Absolutely. And just for those unaware on the call, CPE stands for the Common Product Enumeration. Just kind of adding on more to Cassie's point, what makes it a bit of a challenge is if you were to go look up a CPE, whether that's one you've kind of generated yourself or you're consuming from an SBOM, and you find no results, you may assume that there's no vulnerabilities associated with that particular product conversion. But the reality is the CPE itself just may be misformed, or the product name has changed, or someone has decided to show it in a way that different makes sense. So just wanted to kind of bring that full circle and understand that you can actually end up missing risk by something as simple as, missing one character, right? Or something of that nature. So,
Yes.
but yeah, on with that, it's actually like a great segue into talking more about the SBOM structure itself. So now FOSSA supports both common SBOM formats in both SPDX and then CycloneDX. I won't go through each one of these things, but things that I do want to kind of call out that are very common amongst both of them is the dependency relationships, relationships between SPDX elements and then dependency relationships on the CycloneDX side. I think that's incredibly important and something that is actually commonly lost when you start to generate SBOMs, which is how do you actually truly relate your direct to transitive dependencies? How do you not have just essentially a flat list that has lost a lot of that context, which then becomes even more important when you need to remediate and figure out where the source of these vulnerabilities are coming from. I think other things like composition and package information and the component information, these are all just different flavors of the same things, and that is where you would then find all of those NTIA elements that we were speaking on before in the form of supplier, author, name, component, so on and so forth. I think the last thing that's really interesting about both of these formats is the ability to have the flexibility to support things like external references in the form of SPDX, and then properties in the form of Cyclone DX. So that way you can then start to extend any of your base information with anything else that you want to tie into that, right? If you have external advisories, if you have external information from like a reporting perspective. And so these are all things I'm really, really excited about. Would love to hear more about how, you all are approaching these two formats at Schneider.
Yeah, so the two formats are interesting. Let's say over time, I've asked my team itself from a technical standpoint, which do you prefer? And I've asked everybody else. I mean, it's sort of like at different SBOM meetups and things, which format are you using? Which format are you using? So we at Schneider can support both. We can import both, we can export both and provide both. I steer more toward the Cyclone DX just because of the rapid nature of it, but SPDX is a standard and it's got a release candidate right now out there. So they both have, from an SPDX, I think they're both international in that sense of the word. But when something comes standardized, I don't know which one will, truly, if ever, we'll see it flex between both in the industry. Now, from a Cyclone DX, I know that there's a lot of work that's gone into doing the AI bomb and the different kinds of things, but SPDX pieces have that too. So I really think that both of them are growing, and it's just a matter of how quick can they stay up to date, because this is an ever-changing world. In fact, we just had last year the CISA ICT SCRIM task force, which is the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, release a hardware bill of materials document. And they both had pieces that could manage hardware, but now there's this other, just say, set of relationships in that document, so that we want these to continually evolve.
Absolutely, yes. And I think it'll always be a fun game that we'll continue to play between government acronyms and then marketing acronyms, and we'll find our way in the middle to figure out which ones are correct. So,
Yeah.
No, I think that's really exciting. I think the only other thing I would add to that is, at the end of the day, I think both formats are going to be here for a long time. They're not going anywhere. And so it's kind of, that personal decision of a combination of what's your use case, what is your tooling support, what is your supplier's tooling support, and then kind of make a holistic decision on which ones would you like. Would you kind of echo that sentiment, or is that how you all approach it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why we're not being prescriptive and telling our suppliers to, you must provide it in that format. It's not, for us to say, you have to give it to me. And then when customers, they have the choice to get whichever format they want. And there's still some that just want, especially from a procurement, I want a human readable version also.
Yes.
And these are machine readable versions.
And that actually is a really, really good point to call out, that the intention of these formats is to be machine readable. So, tools like FOSSA and other tools can ingest those, and then you start to do a lot of, fun scaling kind of information. And do you have any opinion on what like the human readable format is? We have what we call like attributions, and then kind of just raw bill of materials. I'm kind of curious on your mindset on that one.
It's generally been first level dependencies, the version numbers. Generally, it does not include license information. That is for them to research and validate. But some of them that I've received, especially machine readable, had the license details in there too. But yeah, we do have all of that, the license information, just maybe not to the level of detail that you would get, of course, from a machine readable format. It wouldn't have the different kind of PURLs and project URLs and different kinds of information in that. And in fact, if you go to Instagram's about page, somewhere in there, it'll list the license components. And to me, that's a human readable version, because it'll show you what's in use.
100%, 100%. So no, I completely agree with that. It's probably also a good segue for us. And then I'll jump in a little bit more tactically. on what does an SBOM actually look like, right? If you've never experienced one of these, if you've never seen it, they are supported in various, SPDX has tag values, CycloneDX has both JSON and XML, SPDX has JSON as well. I'm a big JSON fan, so you're going to see a lot of those examples. It's kind of just the world that I live in, makes it easy to understand.
Yes.
But 100%, these are the same component, have materially the same information. There are some things around like license declared, right? SPDX is clearly background and license compliance starting to come out there with license declared versus license concluded. And then, of course, Perl being something natively supported in CycloneDX as of 1.2, I believe, and then SPDX as of 2.2. And so both of those have full support for that, which I will continue to champion as probably the most important field if you're going to include it in an SBOM for me personally, for anything that is open source, right? And then, of course, closed source stuff, you can use CPs or other unique identifiers. So not too much here from a tactical perspective, but anything you wanted to add, Cassie? If not.
Yeah, I want to point out that for some of our products, especially legacy products, even though they're open source, there's no Perl, because the open source project might have been embedded. I mean, we're talking some of our products, OT operational technology products, can last for decades. So it's not a modern build pipeline,
Right.
and the source code is included. So there are still products out there where you may not have the Perl or that information, because there is no, linking, or they do not have the provenance and the pedigree information for the original project that they might have downloaded. Now, if there's been updates to it and they capture that for any, libraries that have been updated. But sometimes if you're forking it and it's, or let's just say for those, if you make a copy of it, and you take on the responsibility, and you may take also, if there's a security update, you may absorb that and bring it in yourself. So there's a term called backporting. But there are cases out there where that information won't be in there. And if that's important to you, ask the question, because it wasn't until we did an analysis project with a government agency, and they asked the question, that even I realized, this product is 5th generation. And so the code base, comes with it, but it also has older pipelines, and let's just say compiled binaries.
No, the legacy code space. I am having so many joyous memories of being back at GE and working with 50-year-old code that if we change in any way, shape, or form, we'll shut down our entire critical infrastructure. But it keeps the lights on, which is really, really fun. I think something I wanted to kind of make a little bit more real is I completely agree with you that, Perl is a great, starting point, but if the Perl is not publicly accessible, it still didn't really get you very much, right? Other than some additional information. And in this case, right, if we look at code mirror, we have a namespace in NPM, public registry, the name code mirror itself, and then the version. But, Cassie, your team could easily fork this, right? Maintain this internally within Schneider Electric. And now that Perl completely changes because the namespace is different. And to your point, the backporting one is such an interesting challenge that I did want to, kind of get your mindset on real quickly, which is it has the potential for both presenting false positives and false negatives, from the sense of there may be vulnerabilities that you've introduced by forking this that are now no longer tracked, and then vice versa, which is the happier path, which is you've actually remediated a lot of those vulnerabilities. Any advice for someone kind of starting an SBOM program and trying to deal with that challenge?
Well, I would have to say there's always going to be false positives and negatives because of that. And just in general, being able to identify. And if you don't understand sort of the term backporting, I like Red Hat's. They've got a great blog post on what backporting is. They've done a really good job about that. And what you really have to ask the teams, is this, it's a pretty simple question. Are you using let's say bit for bit, the exact duplication of what's out there, or is this a modified version? And I think as we see SBOMs mature, there's going to be a better way to be able to explain that. It's not there right now, so that the tools can say, this is this type of let's just say object in the code, and it has, the responsibility is being maintained by the supplier, or, it's this derivative of it. And we really don't have enough of that explanation. We all know it in the development side, in the back end, but being able to explain that and put it, come up to a way to put this into the schemas, it's going to take some time for us to all get agreement on how to document that. So I don't have a solution for you today other than to ask the development team if someone comes with the questions. And that'll lead us into our discussion on VEX, because that's what VEX will help do. It won't necessarily help with false negatives, like things that are missed, but it can help with false positives.
No, 100%. I think it's a perfect segue, because that is exactly what I was thinking as well, which is, to your point, this is not a silver bullet solution, but I think it's starting to bring us much closer to dealing with what I call CVE fatigue to a certain extent, right? There's so many vulnerabilities coming from all of your scanning tools all at the same time. You have no idea where to start. And the reality is, oftentimes you're not actually truly impacted by these things based on the way you're actually using those particular components, functions, or, kind of derivatives. And so let me kind of set the stage here a little bit. When you think about a VEX statement, right, a vulnerability exploitability exchange statement, the kind of goal is to communicate the status of a detected CVE. Now, there's various ways that you can do that. You can do that via the CycloneDX format. I think SPDX natively supports VEX as of 3.0, the release candidate as well. And then, of course, you have your wonderful CSAF, the Customer Security Advisory Framework. These are all various ways to kind of communicate that information. What are the most important things that you want to communicate are, obviously a time step, when did this happen, just background information, the author, all that kind of good stuff. Product details, what is the component, what is the overall product, obviously some unique identifier, whether that be CP or Perl, version information, so you know exactly what you're using. Vulnerability details, very, very straightforward there. CVE, severity, CWEs, any external references that you can kind of point to, all of that wonderful information. But in my opinion, the most important part is the status, right? And so is that status affected, not affected, under investigation, or fixed? And if you are going to supply a not affected status, then you have to supply justification and preferably some detailed information for why that justification makes sense. And then, of course, if you have affected, then ideally you would provide some form of mitigation, some form of step or task for your customers or consumers of that software to be able to take. And so with that, we do start to get, to your point, very close to addressing a lot of the, kind of false positive detections from an active vulnerability perspective. Help me understand a little bit more about how you think about that status piece in particular, knowing that that is now someone else making a determination, potentially outside of your organization, on if they're affected or not.
Yeah. So if you provide an SBOM to somebody, they can run it through any number of tools, imported into FOSSA. There's some free tools and open source tools out there that you can do it. And they're all going to come up with different answers. They're going to find something different, just like we talked about the CPEs, because they might not have the same association. Or let's just say the SBOM that was originally generated, not by humans, but by tools, and it can't recognize the exact version of something. So let me give this as a use case. What would happen is, so let's say it identified Apache, but it didn't know which version of Apache. So most tools, I think all tools, will say, well, I'm going to show and acknowledge every CVE ever assigned to this product because you didn't tell me, this version, and start it. And so that creates, tons of false positives. And from VEX statement, honestly, the first thing you need to do is have a better quality SBOM, which does list the version number. And then with the VEX statements, being able to identify what are some of the more common statuses. So even if, as a supplier, I include the VEX statement, my ability to identify which one should I provide a status on could be different than somebody else who's run the SBOM through it, and they found a different CVE, or there was a CVE released the next day, right? So, March 1st, there's a new CVE and it's not in my VEX, but yet from an SBOM standpoint, you could tell that that library is being used. Yep. So we're really having that information. You've got to think about, SBOMs are static. They are tied to that release. And even though the SPDX and Cyclone DX can take in the VEX information, the challenge really here, and we'll see a bit about that, is that VEX information is living. It can change, 10 minutes from now, right? We can add more information, status can change. So those timestamps and what is bringing in is very important. So I think that a lot of us, that think about transactions and, okay, this transaction was done on this date at 5 p.m., and yet I'm going to then apply the next transaction that was at 5:10 p.m. And that's how we need to think about VEX statements, which means that the VEX information that somebody may ingest could be minutes or, months or whatever old. And so from an industry standpoint, how are we going to keep that up to date? I think that over time, we'll see where all that VEX information is being fed through various channels. So, for example, FOSSA, one day has the capability where Schneider can, provide SBOMs, but also a live feed, of VEX information. You would have the latest and greatest. And so you've got to think about those statuses. They're not set in stone, and that wasn't the purpose of them. And so it's going to be a big challenge for us over time.
No, and I think that you really hit on a very, very important point, which is that the vulnerability information is extremely dynamic, but the component information is static, right? That's the SBOM itself. And I completely agree with you that we are continuing to move more and more to a world where this SBOM is a static document, but you have to think about it in a very dynamic way. And so to your point, I think there's going to be great partnership opportunities where you can essentially, share your SBOM with, a consumer, supplier, any of that nature, and then they are constantly receiving updates. And that would actually even make your life a bit easier as well, because every time that new celebrity vulnerability comes in, you can immediately ask your engineering teams, ask them what that status is. Are you impacted by that? Give an update, and then within minutes, right, a customer has now seen this, as compared to the potentially days, weeks, or months that we go now. Now I know that is a happy path and future facing,
right? And that's really when you see on the screen the CSAF, the Common Security Advisory Framework, it is also a point in time, but it's a bit more static. So for example, during Log4j, I don't recall how many, but we released our security advisory, which most people, that's the just readable one, the PDF version. But we also release CSAF documents. So those are the machine readable version, those artifacts of the PDF version that a human can read. And I think, for example, some of these, especially celebrity CVEs, there could be multiple updates, and it's not uncommon to probably be on a 8th or 10th version. And the reason is, especially for a large company like ours, we're releasing these security advisories based off of a CVE or a set of CVEs or at a product. So for example, the Log4j ones, there were multiple CVEs associated with that, and we released that. And as our teams came to us, because we have 15,000 intelligent products, so we don't list all 15,000 and all of those commercial references. They're usually, this family not affected. We don't even go to that level unless it's a key product. But if they are, affected and there's mitigations, we list those. And so the CSAF would say, for example, product name, version 6.9 and earlier affected, version 7 and above unaffected, but we don't list the maybe 18 versions of that product. So we're going to also see that over time. And then there was, especially in that case, we were releasing updates every week. We wanted to keep that updated. And that's, that information, we would have had the VEX object and figured that out right away. But to get it into the corporate processes and make sure that those are updated into the machine readable PDF so people can understand it, that's, that takes more time. We don't release a new PDF version every 5 minutes.
No, I completely get that. And honestly, I think it's probably a really, really good segue for us to kind of walk in to our example. Because what I want to do is then try to make this more tactical, for our listeners today. And so we're all going to imagine for a second that we are now on Cassie's product team, that we're delivering some really awesome, intelligent functionality here. And so kind of throughout our build process, we're going to imagine that we're generating this SBOM at the kind of final product build, the true deliverable artifact, right? In that case, I think a lot of yours are binaries. For you, that could be a SaaS application. For other customers, right? It kind of just depends on whatever that deployed artifact is. You've generated your SBOM. You've ran all of your components via your internal vulnerability database. You've compared that to anything that your developers are saying are no longer affected and all that wonderful things. Thus, you've now generated a VEX document that now truly enumerates all of those vulnerabilities. And that then ends up finally in some form of report that you can either share internally or externally. I'm curious as to what does that experience look like for you and Schneider Electric, in particular, if new vulnerabilities come out after you've already produced, the software bill of materials in this workflow.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, most of our SBOM generations at the moment are from binary analysis, and that is due to the nature of for certain products they may be only updated quarterly or yearly. Now our digital products and our software applications and cloud products, obviously, those can be those have more modern pipelines. And so I would say over 95% currently of our SBOMs are through that pack, let's just say, sort of after the fact. What happens with ours, and that's where the VEX information is very difficult. An SCA tool itself, unless it has the capabilities to maintain that state. So let's say you have, just even a small SBOM with only a few open source packages, and you have this long, or this list of vulnerabilities that are in there, and lows and mediums, right? Small, low risk items on the CVSS and just vulnerability rating systems. And so developers taking, the ability to then go into the tool and rate those take a lot of time. They do that as part of the build process. So these SCA tools are used as part of the build process, but not all the tools have had in the past the ability to maintain that state. And that's a very important piece of it. I don't want to have to answer this question over and over if I've said, yes or no or whatever. And that's why we're not seeing really as much from our side. The VEXs are not at the SBOM stage, and why we're having to do them at the security advisory piece. Now, for those that are part of the build pipeline and where there's more information that can be included into it, where it can take the notes and we can embed or modify the scripts to be able to acknowledge that, it's easier. But for us, this is still a challenge, and I have not honestly received any SBOMs from vendors that have VEXs either. So I think that this is a challenge for a lot of us. And how do you scope which ones to comment on?
Yes.
Like I said, you've got lows and mediums. What about the celebrity? So let's give an example again of Log4j. I am not going to include a VEX statement that Log4j, the CVE, because it's not even used as open source in this product. But there are definitely products that do include Log4j, but may not have had the actual lines of code that were affected, right? So all that analysis being done, and it takes time to go through it until the tools, just all around really mature, where all the intricate details of what a developer says. But then also you have to, the comment field, you have to make sure it's approved before going. If you say affected, but there's a mitigation, we have a very strict, these are the mitigation pieces to follow. And so that's working with tool vendors to say, these need to be our string tables of what we're allowed to use and comment on. And of course, a lot of, we also, the one thing about advisories is it has also the CWEs, the common weakness or enumeration, to explain more about it. And VEXs don't really have that level of detail that we think is also valuable. So we are just at the beginning stages of really building this into the pipeline. And what we're doing right now is it's sort of an ad hoc after activity that we will merge into SBOMs.
No, absolutely. And then just kind of speaking on the scale challenge a little bit there, right? If you think about, how many, I think you mentioned what, like 15,000 intelligent products that you mentioned, all of which have, in number of versions associated with it.
Yes.
Now, how does your brain start to think about to handle like, that level of scale if you have, potentially thousands of VEX objects that you would need to create, or maybe hundreds
Millions.
of thousands, right?
Millions. I've estimated it will be millions.
And so, yeah, what I'm hearing is tooling needs to come a long way to make.
Hello? Did I lose?
Oh, I am so sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I
Okay.
wasn't sure if I got lost or.
No, my Chrome. I guess I don't know if it ran out of RAM or something, but it just kind of crashed on me. So yeah,
Okay.
hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Alrighty. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with my video, but as long as you can hear me, that's all that matters.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I think we've kind of talked about the scale challenge here
Okay.
to a good degree. And so now that we've kind of understand this example from an SBOM producer standpoint, right, a software producer standpoint, I think it is also really interesting to then think about how do you operationalize VEX from a consumer of software. And so now we're kind of changing our example a little bit here of where we're saying we are all, purchasing some form of commercial software. They're providing an SBOM to us on a regular basis for that version of it. And then, a massive CVE kind of comes out, right?
Yeah.
That within weeks of implementing that product. How would you approach that challenge, and how would you think about looking at the impact within your organization?
Yeah, certainly. And I thought it was such an important piece that's why I included this diagram in my book, is, in some areas of folks think SBOMs have all of that data in there, but it's not necessarily true. So where is the value, and what do you do when a CVE comes through? So if you hear about a vulnerability and you're looking for acknowledgement of whether or not you, with the product that you have that you're using, are impacted, it's first you can look to see if there's any information about there, and a disclosure such as that security advisory may have that information. And if they don't, you contact the vendor. I mean, that happens with all of these large celebrity CVEs, and especially the exploitable ones, is we'll receive calls from our customers saying, are you affected? And from in the first few minutes, our standard holding statement is, we're investigating, because it takes time to review all the products. And then as soon as we have that advisory, we provide it and can tell folks whether it's impacted. But with a VEX, as I said, it's a point in time, right? And so let's say you heard on the 5 o'clock news that there's a new vulnerability, and you go to check your software bill of materials, you see that open source library is there, and it doesn't have any VEX information of whether or not you're infected. You can check to see whether or not, if there is an updated VEX information for that information, to say whether or not you're infected, and go back to the suppliers. Follow their process for either taking in that additional information for the VEX, or that they're not affected. So there are a couple paths. Overall, if you are fairly certain, because you have the SBOM, that the library does exist, or there's a chance of it, take mitigations, perform whatever mitigations you're hearing in the news. CISA releases great advisories about what to do for not only their own agencies, but out to other areas of what mitigations. And sometimes it could be, close this port or patch to this version, because you may not be on the latest version, or, if it's possible, make it not internet connectable. So definitely follow those. So you've got, the many cases, either if you don't have an SBOM at all, assume you are impacted and check with your supplier. If you have an SBOM, even if it's not listed, take some level of precaution, because not all SBOMs are perfect or complete. And then third, follow the VEX route.
Excellent. And then just one quick follow-up on this one around trying to think about risk tolerance. When you're an organization, right? If I were to make it a really tactical example, let's say you have a CVE comes out, it's about improper input validation. The software producer says, no, actually, I am validating the input before I even pass any information into that component, and so there's some inline mitigation already in place. Do you trust that as a consumer of that software? Do you have to consider maybe that they didn't implement their input validation in a correct way, or how do you start to think about risk tolerance from your own internal organization versus how someone externally may be approaching that?
Well, it really depends on intended use within your organization. If it's, let's say, a printer, that might maybe have the same level of risk versus whether it is Microsoft Teams or something at that level. So first, the intended use and where you have prioritized that in the platform. In the case of certain things, input validations or any of the other CVEs, let's just say if the vendor or supplier has not responded, assume that you are not impacted. And then if they have responded, to say they are not affected. I think generally most of us are doing quite manual activities to confirm that. We do not want to say not affected if it's not the case. Now, but also, there's this word that we use called transitive dependency. That means the fourth party and fifth party. And extend it on. So let's say I use a proprietary or commercial library of somebody's, and I don't have their full SBOM list yet because this is new to everybody. And it's let's just say a DLL or a Microsoft.NET DLL where I don't have the source code, right? I have to make some assumptions that they're not affected because I can't scan it myself. And they may, and so I might say not affected for that product because nothing indicates that. And if something happens later and Microsoft, for example, says, yes, this .NET DLL is affected, all of a sudden I have to change because those transitive dependencies, I don't know until my suppliers and all the upstream has also acknowledged it. And that's the complexity that we're going to run into because our third and fourth party suppliers may have implications or being affected, and it's going to take time for that information to come through. So there are going to be changes to that answer depending on what information is found out later. So always trust but verify, validate, but really take the risk level and the intended use to see if you should be, take additional precautions.
Yes, I love that mindset of, trust but verify, right? And I think that the one thing I just want to kind of echo a little bit is it's kind of been a common theme throughout this conversation, which is that SBOM is, a very static document, but all the information around it is very, very dynamic. And so I think we're getting closer and closer to this world of where, like for FOSSA, for example, we actually encourage for our customers to distribute their SBOMs via one of our products that we have in progress around this SBOM portal. That then allows for you to have releases match to specific versions. Those specific versions have VEX statements associated with them, and those VEX statements can be updated indefinitely, even beyond when someone has point in time downloaded an SBOM, which gets you much, much further out of this Google Drive emailing SBOMs out to individual users, and much more into this almost SBOM lifecycle management workflow where you can really ingest that information on a regular basis. So I know we're getting closer to time here, so I just want to go over a few recommendations before I kind of, save plenty of time for what is the most important part of the webinar for me personally. And so as we think about, various part of the SBOM lifecycle management that we've talked about today. SBOM generation is definitely huge, right? Where do you want to make sure that you're generating your SBOM? Ideally, before that final product. And so that could be a build phase for you in a SaaS product, that can be a deployment stage, or in the case of distributed binaries, right? You want to go ahead and scan it there so that we have a final representation of what all components are going into the version that your consumers are actually using. And this may seem like a very straightforward thing, but I think in practice, I've seen many more people miss out on this step than they realize because they are scanning or they're generating their SBOMs too early, which is actually a great practice. It's just one you have to continue to do on every phase of that, application's deployment. I think from there, we've hammered deeply, right, on distributing SBOMs, recognizing that an SBOM is static, but the VEX and all the associated information is very dynamic. And so, and at least, especially in this phase where I think that the tooling is a bit early, decoupling that VEX statement starts to become a really, really powerful tool, because then your SBOM can remain static and then you can consistently update that VEX statement on a regular basis. And then just the last piece that I will call out is around, taking a look at that non-affected status and then applying that through the lens of what your own risk tolerance is. I think you had a really, really good point on, what products are they going into.
Yeah, I would want to comment though. I think if the product itself has had a CVE associated with it, those should always be in the SBOM as a VEX.
Yes.
So rather than just the open source VEXs, but anything tied specifically to that CPE should become standard practice inside of that SBOM, so that when you're receiving it, the earlier, whether or not it's impacted, which is, I'm sure it usually isn't, that the CVEs for that specific CPE name are listed in there.
Oh, 100%. I think it's an interesting world where you're essentially embedding the point in time VEX, but you're decoupling the dynamic over time VEX as new vulnerabilities kind of come out, right? Which I'm spot on. Before we move away from this, was there any other just recommendations and takeaways that you have, given your wealth of experience, Cassie?
I think just be nice to your suppliers. We're working on all of this from a takeaway. And somebody had a great question at the beginning that how accurate is binary analysis, or the disadvantages for binary analysis. And for those generated, if a company is using, if it's a modern pipeline, I see with a lot of just open source and not commercial libraries, then I see them to be very accurate. If it is an older product that has sort of, not everything in it that can be read properly during binary analysis, and if it has commercial libraries. So let's say, pretend I'm buying a crypto library from a commercial vendor. That fingerprint is not in the open source world, right? That signature. Right. And so we had one product that we did the analysis and had 10 commercial libraries. So the SBOM results were about 15% accurate. And then, you can't always differentiate, especially in binary analysis, between the versions, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it may be off on a version because the signatures are almost exactly, the actual open source is very similar. So, getting it from your supplier, but I always, before we distribute it to customers, I then have the development team validate it at this point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that's incredible. And kind of without further ado, I've gone ahead and posted an announcement as well. I know that you have a wonderful new book that has just recently released. Definitely, everyone, you should see the Amazon link in the announcements. I encourage you to go out and purchase it. I already have, and I look forward to reading it more. But tell us more about the book. What motivations did you have, and anything that you would like to share?
Sure. Well, I work a lot with suppliers, as you've probably guessed, but we have a lot of companies that we purchase, and there are so many people in their application and product security journeys that are just starting out, right? This is cybersecurity is a fairly new field, but application and product security is even newer, unless you're in industries such as ours, which we've been following what's called the IEC 62443 standard for years. We helped write the standard, and it's over a decade old, about secure development. And so I spent a lot of time sending links to suppliers explaining different processes, because it's so much more than even just the build process. If you are buying, an iPhone, as I mentioned, it's got 50 apps, right? And so all of the millions of developers that have contributed over time to there. And then you've got the manufacturing process and the hundreds of thousands of people that are involved. So this book covers more than just software. It talks about infrastructure security in the development environment, in the lab environments, because, for products that are physical, cyber physical, they've got test labs. And then there's, of course, infrastructure from the manufacturing environment. So I also cover all of those because, your development team may be doing, and who you're buying from, they may have followed all of these processes, but yet the integrity is lost during the manufacturing process and somebody compromises it there. And so all of that was really important for me to include. So it's written for procurement people, for legal people. I mean, when I talk about more technical pieces, I explain it, but it's more so that there's 200 references for you to go learn more about if it's interesting. Because it's important, even if you're in legal or procurement, to understand, what does software integrity mean? All right. And what does, why is cryptography important to this? And why is having, a hardware module that does security could be important in your decision making? So I've not written it for cyber experts. Right. I have written it for people who are trying to understand and can make some difference in the risk profile.
No, that's absolutely incredible. And would you say that you feel like the book information be really valuable for both software producers and software consumers, as we've kind of talked about those two dichotomies?
Yes, absolutely. Being a software consumer, many of the points in there, especially a whole chapter on suppliers, where I talk about, ask your supplier this, go, look for this. Don't assume this. Don't assume if they've got a 27001 certification that they know how to write secure software, because it's not in there. And so I talk about that and why they need to understand these other concepts. So absolutely, if you're producing or consuming, it's for both groups.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yes, I encourage everyone. They should definitely kind of go out and purchase your book and give it a good read. I think it's going to be a wealth of information in there for them. I know that we have just a couple minutes here, and we have had a few questions that have come through for you. So I do want to go ahead and ask those. Is there anything else related to the book or any other SBOM webinar content that you wanted to say before I jump in the Q&A, Cassie?
No, I think I addressed one of the questions, so we can go forward with those.
Perfect. Definitely. So one of them, first and foremost, yes, the webinar is definitely being recorded. You can share it out with, other users. They can just register, and then they'll be able to watch it in its entirety. So you'll be 100% good to go there. I think you may have spoken on this one a little bit, but just for clarity, they're asking, how accurate are binary analysis, or what are disadvantages of binary analysis on SBOMs?
Yeah, well, I gave my perception. So, from a FOSSA standpoint, how are you seeing it? Because it's evolving every day. I mean, I know that we're constantly tuning for different tools. So, what about FOSSA?
So you talk about the provenance problem, right? And that is one that is definitely very, very challenging, of where if I'm doing a, fingerprint matching on a binary tool, component, I'm then comparing that. The reality is, like, especially when it comes to versions, the fingerprint itself doesn't typically change. Or it doesn't change dramatically unless there's been like massive code updates. And so we tend to think about it as version ranges rather than specific versions. And that's the only way, in my opinion anyway, that you can begin to have accurate results as it pertains to analyzing from a binary perspective. Now, I think the thing that I would always encourage is that you should try to analyze as much as the way, right? Like I'll share this because I know that we've had this conversation, but the SBOM at the binary piece is where you're generating your SBOM, but you scan throughout the entire CI/CD pipeline.
Yes,
And that's
we
what
do.
everyone, right, should be doing. And you should be generating SBOMs along that way. And the reason why it's the most important for me is because then you have the context of where this actual component was brought in used versus analyzing at the binary point in time means that you've essentially lost all that context and it's completely flat for you. In particular, when you start thinking about transitive dependencies, which I know that you spoke to earlier. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. And I think we have, kind of similar mindsets on, try your hardest to get information, but recognize that there will be false positives just in the nature of that fingerprinting algorithm. I'll ask you this question, but I'm happy to kind of provide some context to this one too, because it's a little bit more licensing focused. But the question is, if we receive an alert regarding a missing license due to transitive dependencies, they're wondering, should we inform the original author or the company that distributed the software? What constitutes the best approach? And I have a strong opinion here, but I didn't know if you had one before I went.
Well, I haven't had anybody come to me specifically. That doesn't mean we've not gotten the questions. I would suggest both, in my opinion, rather than try one or the other. And just in general, for some companies, we may not even have the same answer as somebody else,
Yes.
and I've seen errors where we've had to adjust it, because the tooling, there could be multiple versions licensed depending on the version, right?
Yes.
So it does get complicated. So being polite and requesting clarification is important. So, but go ahead, Cortez. What is?
No, I think I completely echo your sentiments. I think doing both is definitely the smart tactic. I think that I would probably approach it from asking why that license is missing and not necessarily assuming that it is. Because to your point, there's actually a lot of edge cases that people don't think about, in particular in the world of like dual and multi-license software. Oftentimes, a developer or an author of a component will decide like, hey, instead of BSD2 versus GPL2, like, these are used in a kind of a or capacity. Obviously, I'm going to opt into BSD2, so I don't have to worry about, some of the headaches that comes with using GPL sponsored code. And so I just may not even include GPL in there whatsoever, right? You'll then run that through a tool like FOSSA. Because we look through all licenses and all transitive dependencies, we'll then find that GPL call out and say like, hey, this is actually a missing license that you have here. But the reality is that, that person does have that ability to choose what obligations they will apply to when that is provided. And so it's those type of edge cases that I think, not necessarily assuming that the license is missing, but then asking why it's missing. And if they don't know that it's missing, then yes, that's a different conversation. And you have to decide with the author what obligations are both they and now you going to be beholden to based off of this new information. So.
Right. And that's why it's important to have that information in the SBOMs.
Exactly.
So that you can declare which is being used.
100%. So with that, I know we're at time here. Any kind of closing thoughts from your perspective before we hand out?
I just, it's been a pleasure to be here with FOSSA and just in the community in general. We're a pretty tight knit. There's different tools, but I really appreciate you for inviting me onto this webinar.
Absolutely. Well, no, as I said, I knew you were going to be a wealth of knowledge. I didn't even realize how much. I've learned so much just myself. I hate that my camera has, jumped off on me, but thank you for bearing with me. And overall, I've had a great presentation. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined. And I look forward to the next one, Cassie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.